And now I get to introduce our featured speaker today. Esther returns. Maybe that's all I need to say. Esther returns. As many of you know, Esther Wallace works and plays in the realms of meaning-making, sacred space, and social justice. Esther is a graduate of Star King School for the Ministry and is very interested in emerging spiritual communities and the intersections of ministry and disability. We all look forward to hearing more of how we can deepen our trust. Welcome, Esther.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be back, as always. Good to see many familiar faces, and I think some faces that are new to me this time. So happy to be here. I found myself on a boat, looking over a beautiful and slightly agitated blue ocean. My future spouse, Alex, who is here with me today, now my spouse, and I were visiting their parents, who were living in Tahiti at the time. We were theoretically on this boat in this beautiful, slightly agitated blue ocean to swim with whales. And I say theoretically because at that moment, I was feeling distinctly uncertain about this plan. I've always loved whales, and when my in-laws pitched the idea of swimming with humpbacks, I was there for it. I had visions of floating next to gentle giants in a calm, still, lagoon-like ocean of clear blue water. And in my imagination, we'd just be chilling together, me and the whales, two very different species in gentle communion. But in reality, on the boat, things were looking very different. The ocean currents were strong that day, whipped up by winds so that small waves rolled and rocked the boat. Our feisty guide and most of the other people on the boat only spoke French, and we were given rapid instructions about what to do in a language I didn't understand. Alex translated for me and said, "Yesterday the whales were sleeping and very calm, and let people hang out with them for hours. But they're very active today. He says that when he gives the word, we need to jump in and swim fast." Jump in and swim fast. I have never been a very strong swimmer, and those words did not go down easy with me. I began to feel unsettled, a sense deep down in my gut that jumping in and swimming fast was just not the direction I should take my life. "I'm not sure I'm up to this," I said to no one in particular, and no one in particular paid much attention. "The current seems strong," I suggested, but everybody else seemed to think it wasn't worth remarking on. So when the moment came and the word was given, shouted in French, I hauled myself, snorkel, goggles, flippers and all, into the water. I was immediately overwhelmed. Face down in the water, I couldn't make out anything through my goggles. The sea was a dark, swirling abyss beneath me. My flippers seemed to weigh down my feet, making every kick a struggle. The waves, not a still lagoon-like ocean, crashed through the top of my snorkel and pushed me down and buffeted my body, and it almost felt like being punched. The whales, not in the mood to be observed, had booked it towards the horizon, and try as I might to make progress against this current, I couldn't. And soon it became difficult for me to stay above the waves. It occurred to me that a life jacket would be a really useful thing to have, and I didn't have one. And I began to feel truly afraid, because I was profoundly aware of how outmatched I was by the forces of nature against my human body. I wondered why I hadn't trusted my own instincts to stay on that boat, I wondered if I could trust my body to get me back to the boat. And then I became aware that Alex had come up next to me. I don't remember the exact words that were exchanged, but I know they asked me how I was doing, and I told them I didn't think I could make it back to the boat. In that moment, I was overcome by the ocean. But the broader context was that at that moment came at a time in my life when I felt overcome by the world in many ways. In that state of overcome, I told my partner something that felt logical to me, that they didn't need to wait for me. They could leave me, swim after the whales, and let me struggle against the waves alone. No, they said. We are going to get back to the boat together. The exact details of how we managed it are a blur to me. But what I do remember is surrendering to a sudden feeling of trust. Trust in the pace that we were moving together through the water. Trust in Alex to help me get back to the boat. Trust in them when they told me we were going to make it. We're both here today, so you can guess how the story ends. We made it back, where I stayed for the remainder of the outing. The whales, who never did slow down, eventually graced us with their presence by swimming alongside the boat, breaching the water, slapping their fins, and showing us their exhales. I don't know about you, but for me, existing these days can feel all too similar to being on that boat. The waters of our society are choppy right now, to say the least. The waves of unchecked late-stage capitalism that has valued profit over people are rocking the boat. The winds of authoritarianism are blowing at us full force. Meanwhile, some people on the boat seem all too ready to embrace the wind and the waves, eager to jump right in and make a home in them. Others seem content to ignore the warning signs, focused instead on their imagined ideal boat ride, rather than the reality of what it's shaping up to be. And some of us are noticing all of this unfold with a deep sense of mistrust brewing in our guts. Some of us are already in the waves without a life jacket, fighting the billows of racism, gender oppression, anti-LGBTQIA sentiment, class oppression, and so much more. Sources of information we should be able to trust, newsrooms and newspapers, public intellectuals, even friends, are becoming increasingly polarized, sometimes even printing verifiably false information. Our social media networks are certainly rife with misinformation. Times are troubling, frightening even, and fear is a great friend of mistrust. When we're afraid, we begin to deeply question whether we can trust our communities, our neighbors. We wonder who and what can we trust, if not each other? And I think many of us, consciously and unconsciously, are wrestling with an even deeper question. How do we trust each other? How do we collectively navigate these waters we find ourselves in? How do we work together to create the kind of world we want to live in, which necessitates vulnerability and being in relationships? How do we open ourselves to trusting in a time where trust can be a liability? In her book, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, author and organizer Adrienne Marie Brown outlines 9 principles of what she calls emergent strategy. She describes emergence as the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. She writes that emergence is a way of speaking about the connective tissue of all that exists. that it emphasizes critical connections over critical mass, building authentic relationships, listening with all the senses of the body and the mind. I think there's much there that resonates with our own UU principles. If emergence is a way of speaking about the connected nature of our reality, that sounds similar to the way we think about the interdependent web of existence, of which we are all a part. I could preach a whole series of sermons on the 9 principles of emergent strategy, but today I want to invite us to consider the 7th, moving at the speed of trust. Move at the speed of trust, Brown says. Focus on critical connections more than critical mass. Build the resilience by building relationships. This principle points us in a direction that feels counterintuitive. When we're in the midst of difficult times, we want to retreat. We can be tempted to put up our defenses and isolate because it's just not worth the risk of being hurt by our political systems, our social institutions, by other people. But Brown suggests the power of large-scale systemic change starts with us, with our relationships to ourselves and each other. She says that what we practice at the small scale sets the patterns for the whole system. Brown's own mentor, the activist Grace Lee Boggs, taught her the maxim, transform yourself to transform the world. Brown writes that transforming the self doesn't mean getting lost in the self, but seeing our own lives and work and relationships as a front line, a place we can practice justice, liberation, and alignment with each other and the planet. She points us to 6 practices for nurturing emergence and being in transformative relationships. They are curiosity, vulnerable reflection, being present and intentional, pattern disrupting, self-transformation, and co-evolution through friendship. I want to invite us to briefly consider the first 4 of these, and then briefly spend some more time with the last 2. To move at the speed of trust, we need curiosity, which means admitting to ourselves there are things we do not yet know or understand. It means remaining open to new ideas and change, and greeting that which is new or different or downright strange with attentiveness rather than judgment. We need vulnerable reflection, which I think is an extension of curiosity. To vulnerably reflect is to be accountable to ourselves and others, to be with and acknowledge what is arising in our minds and bodies and spirits, to cultivate an understanding of what it means when we're on the boat and we feel misgivings about jumping in the waters, to trust our guts and admit when our ideas and habits have constricted rather than liberated. We need to be present and intentional. We need to remember, as Venerable Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh teaches, that the present moment is the moment where our lives happen. We need to move with mindfulness and align our thought patterns with our deepest values, living our lives with purpose. We need to disrupt patterns. This practice invites us to use everything cultivated through curiosity and vulnerable reflection and being present to observe and interrupt patterns that undermine our worth and dignity and relationship with the web of life. We gotta question what got us on that boat in the first place, and what we can do about the situation, and what support we need to do it. It invites us to replace harmful patterns with generative patterns, to free our imaginations and replace oppressive paradigms with radical possibilities. And lastly, we get to self-transformation and co-evolution through friendship. They both involve building critical connections, sustaining connections with ourselves and each other, and transforming ourselves to transform the world. So what does that have to do with us being here in a worship service? Well, for one thing, I think our spiritual practices are at the heart of our self-understanding and transformation. They give us space to reflect on our values and integrate the things that matter most to us into our daily lives. They offer us a means to return to ourselves when we stray from the ways which we aspire to live. I think being a spiritual practitioner means being in connection with that which is beyond ourselves in order to connect with our deepest selves. And in addition to being individual endeavors, spiritual practices are collective practices. It matters that we are here in this community, practicing being together, singing together, reading together, sharing our joys and concerns, encouraging each other to live into our values. It matters that we gather here in this community that explicitly values interdependence and inherent worth and dignity. In this community that covenants to honor democratic processes and free and responsible searches for truth and meaning. It matters that we show up to encourage each other to live into these values. And to do this, we've got to be in relationship with each other. We've got to practice vulnerability, being willing to open up and actually share the stuff of our lives. We're called to be in relationship with one another when it's easy and when it's hard, when we get along and when we annoy the daylights out of each other. When I was floundering in the waters and Alex came up to me, I had a profound experience in moving at the speed of trust. And something I didn't mention earlier is that I was also deeply annoyed. I was exhausted and irked by the idea of having to work to get back in that boat. There was a part of me that resented being given instructions in how to swim, when it would be easier to just give up and not have to fight anymore. I felt vulnerable and irritated and not very likable. And yet we got through that water together, moving at the speed of trust. Disability justice author and activist Leah Lakshmi Piepsna-Samarasina has written about disabled life. And I want to bring us to our close by offering some wisdom from her about how we can move in community with each other. She says many of us who are disabled are not particularly likable or popular. With our panic attacks, our trauma, our triggers, our nagging need for fat seating or wheelchair access, our crankiness and inaccessibility, we're seen as pains in the ass, not particularly cool or sexy or interesting. Ableism and poverty and racism mean that many of us are indeed in bad moods. Psychic difference and neurodivergence also mean we may be blunt, depressed, or hard to deal with by the tenets of an ableist world. And I am still arguing for the radical notion that we deserve to be loved, as we are, as is. When we reach for each other and make the most access possible, it is an act of revolutionary love. I believe that to move at the speed of trust, we need to practice revolutionary love, which means showing up when we don't like each other and when we aren't at our most likable, because we deserve a loving world. Showing up when it's really hard and listening to the most marginalized among us when they tell us the shape of the world that would most support them. Moving at the speed of trust means that together we look at the waters ahead of us. We sound the depths and take stock of the weather and note what the water is doing. We are curious and vulnerable and reflective, present and intentional, disruptive of patterns that don't serve us well, and self-transformative. We ask whether we really need to be getting in the water with those whales that don't seem to want to chill with us. We ask ask whether the way we do things on this boat is actually just and loving. We co-evolve through friendship. We don't leave each other behind. And together, we chart a way through the waves. Amen. Selah, blessed be, and may it be so.